Welcome back for another deep dive. And this time, we're going to tackle a topic that's been making headlines all over the place: semiconductors. It's a world of cutting-edge tech, big money bets, and even international intrigue. So get ready to dive deep into the world of semiconductors.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we get into all the drama and the details, let's just level set for a moment. What exactly are semiconductors?
Well, semiconductors are basically these tiny little chips that are the brains behind almost all our modern electronics. I mean, think about it. Everything from your smartphone and your computer to cars, airplanes, even your refrigerator these days, they all rely on semiconductors.
So they're pretty important then.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And what's really making headlines right now is that the U.S. currently manufactures only about 10% of the world's semiconductors.
Only 10%.
Yeah. And the really advanced ones, the ones that are really pushing the boundaries of technology, those are mostly made overseas.
Oh, I see. So what are the implications of that? I mean, is that a problem for the U.S.?
It's definitely a strategic vulnerability. You know, if that supply chain gets disrupted for whatever reason, it could have a huge impact on everything from, everyday consumer products to national security. Yeah. Think about fighter jets grounded because we can't get the chips we need.
Okay, yeah, that's a scary thought. So where does TSMC and this massive investment in Arizona fit into all of this?
Yes, TSMC. That's where things get really interesting. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, is one of the world's leading chip makers. And they're making a huge bet on the U.S. They're investing something like $65 billion to build 3 state-of-the-art factories in Arizona.
Wow, $65 billion. That's an insane amount of money.
It is. It's actually the largest foreign investment in U.S. history.
So what's driving this massive investment? Why is TSMC pouring so much money into the U.S.?
Well, there's a big push from the U.S. government to boost domestic chip manufacturing. Bring those jobs and that technology back to American soil. And they've created some pretty enticing incentives to make that happen.
So you're talking about the CHIPS Act?
Exactly. The GPS and Science Act was passed in 2022. And it offers billions of dollars in funding and tax breaks to companies like TSMC to encourage them to build their factories in the U.S.
So TSMC is basically taking advantage of this opportunity to expand their operations, and the U.S. is hoping to revitalize its semiconductor industry. It seems like a win-win situation, right?
On the surface, it does. But there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Oh, like what?
Well, for starters, TSMC just received a finalized $6.6 billion grant from the GTS Act. And they're also eligible for up to $5 billion in loans. So it's a pretty sweet deal for them.
Yeah, $6.6 billion. That's not chump change. But wasn't there some controversy surrounding the GTS Act?
Absolutely. The GPS Act has been a political football. Some people argue that it's basically a handout to foreign companies.
So they're saying that the U.S. is giving away billions of dollars to a Taiwanese company instead of supporting American companies.
Yeah, that's one perspective. And former President Trump, for example, was pretty vocal about his concerns. He argued that the money could be better spent on supporting homegrown American businesses.
So it's a complex issue with valid points on both sides. But what about the arguments in favor of the CHIPS Act? Why do some people think it's a good idea?
Well, supporters of the act argue that it's essential for national security and for maintaining America's technological edge. They say that by attracting global leaders like TSMC to build in the U.S., we can reduce our dependence on foreign chip makers and ensure that we have a reliable supply of these critical components.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about economics, it's also about national security and staying ahead in the global tech race.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you consider that the first TSMC fab in Arizona actually started production back in April.
Really? Wow, that seems pretty fast for a project of this scale.
It is. It's actually quite impressive, especially considering that this is the first time TSMC has built fabs of this magnitude outside of Taiwan.
So they're really putting their money where their mouth is.
They are. And early reports indicate that the production yields at the Arizona fab are just as good as those in Taiwan, which is a really positive sign.
Okay, so we're starting to see some tangible results from this investment, but is this just the beginning? I mean, could this be the start of a major shift in the global semiconductor landscape?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? If TSMC's Arizona fabs are successful, it could have ripple effects far beyond just chips.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. What kind of ripple effects are we talking about?
Well, to understand the full scope of this situation, we need to explore both the potential benefits and the potential risks.
Okay, so let's start with the potential upsides. What are the best case scenarios here? If everything goes according to plan, what could this mean for the U.S., for the tech industry, and for the global economy?
Well, first and foremost, a successful TSMC operation in Arizona could significantly reduce U.S. dependence on overseas chip production. And as we've discussed, that would be a major win in terms of national security and economic stability. But it goes beyond that. You could also boost American manufacturing, create thousands of high-paying jobs, attract other tech companies to the U.S., and really revitalize the whole semiconductor ecosystem in America.
So it's not just about chips, it's about jobs, innovation, and bringing back American manufacturing.
Exactly. It's a really ambitious undertaking, and if it works, it could have a ripple effect across the entire tech industry.
That sounds pretty amazing. But you mentioned risks earlier. What could go wrong? What are the potential downsides?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is whether TSMC can truly replicate its success in Taiwan within the U.S.
Yeah.
They've spent decades honing their expertise, fine-tuning their processes, building relationships with suppliers, and creating a really efficient ecosystem in Taiwan.
Right. They basically got it down to a science over there.
Yeah, and transferring all of that knowledge and expertise to a new location with a different workforce and different regulations is a huge undertaking. It's not guaranteed to be smooth sailing.
So it's not just about building the factories, it's about building a whole new ecosystem from the ground up.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of political stability. The CHIPS Act has bipartisan support right now. But what happens if a new administration comes in and decides to pull back on funding or change the rules of the game?
That's a good point. Long-term success requires a long-term commitment from both the government and the private sector.
Absolutely. And then there are the global implications to consider.
You're talking about China.
Yeah, China sees Taiwan's semiconductor industry as a strategic asset, and they're investing heavily in their own chip-making capabilities. So TSMC's expansion in the U.S. is definitely something they're watching very closely.
So there's a geopolitical dimension to all of this as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a high-stakes game with a lot of players and a lot of moving parts.
Okay, so we've got TSMC betting big on America, the U.S. government trying to boost domestic manufacturing, China watching from the sidelines. It's a lot to take in. But for our listener who's trying to make sense of all of this, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is a long-term play. The benefits of investing in domestic semiconductor manufacturing won't happen overnight. It takes time to build these facilities, train the workforce, and develop the necessary supply chains.
So patience is key.
Definitely. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's going to take a sustained effort from everyone involved to make it work.
But the potential payoff is huge, right?
Oh, absolutely. If it works, it could be a game changer for the U.S. economy, American innovation, and the global balance of power.
Okay, I'm sold. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what's the latest on TSMC's progress in Arizona? Are they on track to meet their goals?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the first fab in Arizona actually started production back in April. And early reports suggest that the production yields are just as good as those in Taiwan, which is really encouraging.
So they're off to a good start.
Yeah, they are. But there's still a long way to go. They have 2 more fabs to build, and who knows what challenges they might encounter along the way. The semiconductor industry is notoriously complex, and the global landscape is constantly shifting.
So it's still a bit of a gamble.
It is. But it's a calculated gamble with potentially huge rewards. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. Well, one thing's for sure. This story is far from over. We'll be following it closely, and we'll keep you updated on all the latest developments.
And in the meantime, I think the most important thing for our listener is to think about the bigger picture here.
What do you mean?
Well, this whole TSMC venture raises some really interesting questions about the future of American manufacturing. Could this be a model for revitalizing other industries?
You're saying that what's happening with semiconductors could be a blueprint for bringing back manufacturing in other sectors.
Exactly. Think about it. What if we could apply this same approach, a combination of government incentives, private investment, and a focus on cutting-edge technology to other industries that are critical to our economy and our national security?
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, think about batteries for electric vehicles. Most of the battery production currently happens overseas, which makes us vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and price fluctuations.
Okay, I see your point. And batteries are just one example. I'm sure there are plenty of other industries that could benefit from a similar approach.
Absolutely. Pharmaceuticals, renewable energy technologies, critical minerals, the list goes on and on.
So the TSMC story is really about much more than just semiconductors. It's about rethinking our approach to manufacturing innovation and national security. It's about building a future where America is a leader in the technologies that will shape the 21st century.
And that's why this deep dive is so relevant to you, our listener. It's not just about understanding the semiconductor industry. It's about recognizing the potential for transformative change across a wide range of sectors. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping the world around us and how we can navigate those forces to create a better future.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential benefits, the risks, the global implications, and the broader lessons we can learn from this whole TSMC venture. But before we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else you think our listeners should know? Any key takeaways that we haven't touched on yet?
Hmm. Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this is a story that's still being written. There are so many factors at play, and the situation is constantly evolving. What we're seeing now with TSMC's investment in Arizona is just the beginning.
It's like we're in the first act of a really long play.
Exactly. And as the story unfolds, we need to pay attention to the details, the nuances, the unexpected twists and turns. Because it's those details that will ultimately determine the success or failure of this venture and the impact it has on the future of American manufacturing.
So stay tuned, folks, because the semiconductor saga is just getting started.
So stay tuned, folks, because this semiconductor saga is just getting started. But before we move on, is there anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they try to make sense of all of this?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the tech behind semiconductors, the economic and political forces at play, and even touched on the geopolitical tensions. What's the big takeaway for our listener? What should they remember from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we're witnessing a pivotal moment. TSMC's investment in Arizona, it's not just about building factories. It symbolizes a potential shift in the global landscape of technology and manufacturing.
We're talking about a possible reordering of global power, aren't we?
Exactly. And this shift, it impacts everyone, not just the tech giants and the policymakers. It'll influence the products we use, the jobs we have, even the future of innovation.
That's a pretty significant impact. So how does all of this connect to our listeners' lives?
Well, it reminds us to be mindful of these seemingly small developments. Why? Because they often trigger ripple effects that shape our world. The decisions we make now as consumers, voters, and members of this global community, they determine the future we create.
So it's not just about observing these changes, it's about actively participating in shaping them.
Precisely. And let me leave you with a final thought-provoking question. What if this investment in semiconductors is just the beginning? What if other industries could be transformed using this same approach, where government and private industry collaborate to rebuild American manufacturing and secure those critical supply chains?
It's a call to action for all of us to think about the future we want and the steps we need to take to get there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of semiconductors. We hope you've learned something new and perhaps feel inspired to explore this topic further.
It's definitely a topic worth exploring further. And as we've seen, it has implications far beyond just the tech world.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.